Ernest Cuneo played Ivy League football at Columbia University and was in the old Brooklyn Dodgers NFL franchise before becoming a City Hall lawyer and a brain trust aide to President Franklin Roosevelt. While on the payroll of national radio columnist Walter Winchell, Cuneo mingled with the famous and powerful. But his status as a spy remained a secret, hiding in plain sight. All of this is the way Hanover Square Press introduces readers to Thomas Maier's book, The Invisible Spy. Maier, a graduate of Fordham and Columbia, is an author and a television producer. Thomas Maier, can I start with you in chapter 11? And I'll just read the first sentence. On a warm summer afternoon in August 1940, U.S. Senator Ernest P. Lundeen climbed into the plane for a long flight home. I'll stop there, pick it up from there, because that's about as good as your opening chapter story, which we'll get to in a moment.
Yeah. Well, basically, Lundeen was one of the people that the British spies at Rockefeller Center were keeping an eye on, and he got involved. He got onto a plane in Washington, and shortly after the takeoff, the plane crashed. And as the investigation pursued about that, they realized that Lundeen. It came out more and more that Lundeen apparently had been involved with a German spy, as that came out, that information came out about a week or two after the crash, and it was publicized by one of the well-known media figures that was dealing with the central focus of my book, Ernest Cuneo. Cuneo was an attorney who worked for a number of large media figures, and so the information about Lundeen, about his involvement and his staff's involvement with uh, with uh, with the Germans, was something that was a big surprise and was part of the overall context of my book, The Invisible Spy.
What was Senator Lundeen's position? And this was the date was August 1940, before we got in the war. But what was his position on the idea of going to war in Europe?
Well, he was like a lot of Americans at that time. Most Americans did not want to go to war. In fact, in the 1940 presidential campaign, Franklin Roosevelt famously said in his last speech of that campaign, it was up at the Boston Garden, and he said, "I promise I won't send your sons to war." Most Americans, like Lundeen, a number of representatives, were isolationists. They did not want to. They had seen what had happened in World War I, where there were a generation of young men had lost their lives, and so Americans did not want to go to war. The majority of Americans did not want to go to war. Lundeen was one of those representatives. There were a number of Congress people and senators who felt the same way. Most of them were Republican, but some of them were Democrats in the same party as Roosevelt. And so the job of the British spies that were involved in keeping an eye on Lundeen and some of these other congressional figures, their whole motive was to try to convince and change American public opinion to favoring getting into the war, and that was fundamentally what my book is about.
In the same chapter, you talk about a guy named George Sylvester Varick, and you say,
Yes,
when you start talking about him, that on his wall he had photographs of Joseph Goebbels,
right.
Kaiser Wilhelm, and Adolf Hitler. He lived on
Uh-huh.
Riverside Drive in New York. Who was he?
Yes, not too far from Columbia, my stomping grounds at the journalism school there. Yeah, he was a character that went back to World War One, and he was essentially almost like a spy for hire. He had been very sympathetic to the Germans in general. I think as much culturally or ethnically as that was part of it, I think. But he was somebody who was involved with Lundin, and he became pretty well known um, uh, for his uh, uh, for his activities, his pro-German views, even during World War One. In fact, Franklin Roosevelt during World War One, during that time period, he criticized Viereck. So Viereck was out there; he was known, and he was one of the many people in the United States prior to Pearl Harbor who were favoring the Germans. And in fact, there was a huge rally at Madison Square Garden. There was like something like 20,000 people at a rally at Madison Square Garden. And Viereck was one of those people who was amenable to the German cause.
Another name in this chapter, the reason I'm using this chapter is because almost all of your top people that you write about are somewhere in the chapter.
Yes.
Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, he seems to be one of your more interesting characters.
Yeah, he really, really is. He was the top spy for Hitler. He had been a military man, and not unlike other Germans who were professional military people. They were appalled by Adolf Hitler, and yet they were duty bound to pursue things. So Canaris was in charge of the German Abwehr, which was the German spy agency, and he eventually was flipped. He was flipped slowly and purposefully by Allen Dulles, who was a an American spy working for the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services. Dulles was over in Switzerland, and Canaris, um, through a woman that he was having an affair with, they were able to compromise Canaris. And eventually there was an attempt to kill Hitler. And Canaris was part of that scheme. And Canaris eventually came under suspicion by Hitler, who originally didn't think Canaris would be part of the plot. But as things turned out, they realized that he was, and they actually hung Canaris before the end of the war. He was jailed, and they executed him. So he's a really interesting character because the whole idea of double agents plays throughout my book, The Invisible Spy, where there are a number of different people in the book who turn out to be double agents. And I think that's part of the kind of the fun of reading a spy book, is when you can find out that somebody who you think is on one side is actually working for the other side.
Two other people in this chapter, of course, are in your book, uh, Walter Winchell and Drew Pearson. And what roles did they play in this whole story?
Well, they both had one lawyer in common. His name was Ernest Cuneo. Ernest Cuneo is the subject of my book, The Invisible Spy. But uh, they were both really powerful media figures during that time period. It's almost hard to imagine that both of them had columns in newspapers, literally hundreds of newspapers. Winchell was more of an entertainment-minded person, but Ernest Cuneo, who was working with the British spies. He was not only the lawyer for both Winchell and Drew Pearson, but he was a great source of information, both from the White House, which is where Cuneo originally emanates from. He works for the Roosevelt crowd, but Cuneo is working for the British, and so a lot of the British propaganda, the British side, the version of things that they want out there, is conveyed through Cuneo to these two major figures. Winchell was a huge media figure during that time period. He had a radio show on Sunday nights. In fact, Cuneo often would be there. He would go through the copy. Sometimes he actually would write the copy for Winchell's program. So Winchell had both this hugely popular radio broadcast, There was no TV at that time period. We're talking about around 1940. And Winchell would go out afterwards to the Stork Club, one of the hot night spots afterwards. He had his own table at the Stork Club, and Cuneo was part of that table there as well. So he was friends with very closely with Winchell, and also Cuneo worked with Drew Pearson, who had a different type of column. It was fundamentally Washington focused. Later on, Jack Anderson took over that column. It's more investigative. Drew Pearson was a little bit certainly more to the left of Walter Winchell, but he also had a radio program as well as newspaper columns. The name of the column was Washington Merry-Go-Round. And so, but what they did have in common was that Cuneo was their lawyer. In fact, Drew Pearson early on had been a professor at Columbia University, which is where Cuneo went to school, and Cuneo actually had Drew Pearson as a teacher. So they had been longtime friends. But the person behind the scenes is Ernest Cuneo, and that's what he had in common with these two very famous media figures.
Well, to put Walter Winchell in context, there's no media personality today in the news and information business that comes close to having the audience that he used to have of sometimes 40 million people.
Absolutely. That's why, I mentioned that before that Winchell's, it's hard to imagine just the scope of his impact. People who may have seen the old show, The Untouchables, he had kind of like this rat-tat-tat type of verbal approach on the air. It was very rapid, and it really demanded that you pay attention. It was something that, as you mentioned, Brian, he had a huge audience. And so the fact that Cuneo was able to uh, influence both these two major media megaphones, Walter Winchell and Drew Pearson, this was a way in which the British were able to get their point of view and help influence American public opinion.
So where did you discover Ernest Cuneo? Because as you say, he was invisible.
He was. I did about 10 years ago, I did a book about the Churchills and the Kennedys. It was a big fat book about the two families together and their interactions. But in doing that research, as often is the case, you find some sidebar information. I found out that, wow, the British had spies at Rockefeller Center. Now, for me, Rockefeller Center, I'm a native New Yorker. It's a place where the Christmas tree goes up during the holidays and there's skaters there. And in fact, I proposed to my wife 40 years ago. I proposed marriage to her there. So it's a place, for me, it's in the heart of Manhattan. Never dreaming, though, that this could be a hot spot for spies. And but in 1940, when Winston Churchill uh, becomes the prime minister, and bear in mind at that point, uh, Great Britain had been at war for more than a year and a half. I guess it was in 1939 that started, but London was being bombed. Winston is brought in, and one of the key things that he realized that he needed was to have America come into the war. Without America's being involved in the war, Churchill felt that all would be lost, that they would be invaded. So what he decided to do, Churchill was a big believer in the power of espionage, and he put a group of spies up on the 36th floor of the International Building at Rockefeller Center. That's right across from St. Patrick's Cathedral, and it's from there that they ran this foreign spy operation that was designed to do a couple of different things. They got the approval secretly of President Roosevelt by saying we wanted to make sure our supply lines are kept open. But almost as soon as they opened up for business, they also went into two other aspects. They really started almost this almost police action of looking at Nazi spies who were in the United States, but also keeping track of and getting involved in some congressional elections against people who were isolationists. They kept an eye on Joe Kennedy, for instance. They kept an eye on Charles Lindbergh. These were both prominent isolationists at the times. And they also got involved in congressional races. But they also had this huge propaganda operation. That's particularly where Cuneo was involved in all aspects of this, but he particularly was involved in the media aspects. By today's standards, we would call it that he was a media influencer, but he was a lawyer for the, as I mentioned, for both. Drew Pearson and particularly Walter Winchell. And so he had a lot of influence and they did a lot of different things together.
I swear I remember seeing Ernest Cuneo's picture on a newspaper column of some kind somewhere years ago. Is that possible?
Yeah, well, he did, it's one of as a biography, one of the things that I was interested in with Cuneo is that he is initially he played in the NFL. He was a big football star at Columbia, and then he played for the Brooklyn Dodgers. This is like in the very early days of the NFL. And he loved the fame of that. And he got hurt, and his father kind of dressed him down about trying to run after fame and not being serious enough about himself and about his work. And Cuneo wound up going to law school. He first works for Congressman Fiorello LaGuardia, who ultimately becomes a New York mayor. But in that same circle of New York liberals in the 30s, Cuneo works with increasingly with the Roosevelt crowd, what was called the brain trust of Roosevelt. And he becomes an advance man for Roosevelt. He becomes a counsel for the National Democratic Party committee. He's still maintaining a private practice at the same time. And so he becomes a very prominent person behind the scenes. He realizes that pursuing fame is not the right way for him to go, that by remaining anonymous, becoming invisible, that's the key to his success. Later on in life, after the war, a number of the people, including one of his best friends, Ian Fleming, who writes the James Bond books, a lot of these folks who had these exciting experiences with during the war, particularly in terms of spying, they wanted to get their story out. And later on in life, Cuneo realized that this vow of anonymity that he had taken, this whole idea of that he wanted to be more well known, and so he started. He did write some columns for Newsday, the newspaper where I worked for 40 years. But the key to his success was by his own volition, as he says in his memoirs, was by being anonymous, by being behind the scenes, by being invisible.
Please excuse us for interrupting. We'll continue our conversation in a minute. I saw some promotional video with you in it for this book, walking around an empty floor that I gather was room 3603 in the Rockefeller Center. I want to ask you if that's where you were, and why was it empty?
Yeah, well, the building itself was changing tenants. So I just happened to, it's about 2 years ago, I asked the folks at Rockefeller Center, could I actually see this place? When you do a book, I like to, what they call eyeball things. I do like to put my hands in the dirt. I like to see things as they were. So it was set up that I was able to go there with a representative from the Rockefeller Center area. We went up to the 36th floor and they were just tearing down that whole wall. I guess they were preparing for the new client coming in, but you still got a sense of what it was like. In fact, the signs of 36th floor looked like they were the original from the 1940 period. And one of the things that really caught my eye with this was the whole idea of Rockefeller Center with its Art Deco look to it. There was a certain romance about it. In fact, there was a romance in the story. Ernest Cuneo winds up meeting one of the Churchill spies, a Canadian woman named Margaret Watson, and they eventually get married at the end of the war. So the whole aspect of being up on the 36th floor of Rockefeller Center when all these smart aleck New Yorkers who think they know everything are passing by, but they have no clue that there was as many as 1,000 spies during the war, leading up to the war, who were working out of that operation at Rockefeller Center.
How many of those 1,000 were British or Canadian, and how many were American?
Well, it was set up by Churchill with a Canadian spy master. His name was William Intrepid was the code name. Stevenson, William Stevenson, and he was Canadian. He recruited a lot of people from the Winnipeg area. In fact, Margaret Watson, who eventually gets married to Ernest Cuneo, she's from Winnipeg. So there were a substantial number of Canadians. The view about that was that the Canadians would somehow mingle and be less conspicuous in America than some of the British agents. Now, that was not always the case. Ian Fleming, early on in 1940 and 41, worked out of there. And there were a number of other British, but fundamentally, it was Stevenson, a Canadian, who ran the operation at Rockefeller Center.
You open your book in chapter 1 with another story, and it starts off on the chilly Tuesday evening of March 18th, 1941. Two Nazi spies walked briskly through Manhattan's busy Times Square. Take it up from there.
Yeah, well, as you say, there's two Nazi spies walking through Times Square, and one of them gets hit by a car, and they're carrying a satchel full of papers. And those papers were the plans that were being put together to essentially have like a 9/11 type of event in Manhattan to blow up things in New York if America went to war. And so they had these papers. And when the one German spy was hit by the car, the other German spy picked up the satchel and he ran away. And so they had the German spy who was hit by the car wound up dying. It turns out his papers indicated that he was a Spaniard, and the cops, the New York City cops investigating this, they checked with the Spanish embassy, the consul's office, and they said, "We have no idea who this dead guy is." And the cops in the city, New York City, checked with the FBI that was then run by J. Edgar Hoover, and they didn't have any idea of who it was. But eventually, it was the British at Rockefeller Center, the Stevenson agency known as the British Security Coordination. That was its formal name. But they had an idea who these two guys were because they were checking the mail, that mail that would go from the United States to Europe would often go through Bermuda. And the British actually had a spy operation at a fancy hotel in Bermuda, where they actually, in the lower floors, they would go through the mail and they were able to detect a letter by the surviving German agent in this Times Square incident. He had written about the fact of what had happened to the other agent, that he had been killed and had hurt. And they picked up on it and they were able to trace it back. And eventually they found out where this other German agent was. The British worked with the FBI in that regard. And eventually the FBI brought down they had a whole spy operation on this surviving German agent, and they were able to arrest a whole ring of German spies in this country. But it was kind of, to me, I start the book not only because of its dramatic aspects of that incident, but it also underlined just how unprepared the United States were. We didn't have a spy agency at that point. The British were way more advanced than we were. And in fact, it was the British who taught us how to create our own spy agency, the OSS, which is what I mentioned before, the Office of Strategic Services, which was America's first spy agency. It was really created uh, on the model of what Stevenson was running at Rockefeller Center, and it was done on the advice of Stevenson and his people, including Ian Fleming.
How much do you think the Germans knew about the British being in Rockefeller Center back in 40 and 41?
That's a real good question, and I don't know definitively the answer for that. I would imagine that they had some idea about it. The German operation was nowhere close to the British operation. The British operation in the United States was pretty extensive, remarkably extensive. The Germans, as we mentioned, Wilhelm Canaris, the head master spy there, he had some doubts about whether or not they should do this. And they did have some German spies in this country, but they also had a number of German sympathizers, Americans who maybe were ethnically German, who were sympathetic to what was going on with Hitler. And as I mentioned, there was a huge rally at Madison Square Garden about this. And so I think they had a pretty good idea of what was going on, but definitively, I don't know exactly how much the Germans knew about the Rockefeller Center operation by the Brits.
So Ernest Cuneo related to FDR, to J. Edgar Hoover, to William Stevenson. We can go down the list. Is that accurate? All those people knew he was in this mix?
Yeah, well, Ernest Cuneo, what happened when Churchill wanted to put these spies at Rockefeller Center, and he had Stevenson negotiate that for him. Stevenson went to J. Edgar Hoover, and Hoover said, "Look, I can't give you the authority to create this huge foreign spy operation at Rockefeller Center. You have to get the President of the United States approval for that." And of course, Hoover was a very cagey fellow, savvy, politically savvy. So he realized he couldn't do anything he couldn't approve something like this without Roosevelt's okay. So what was decided was apparently Stevenson knew um, uh, uh, well, it was Hoover who knew Ernest Cuneo because Hoover had been a source for Cuneo and Walter Winchell and Drew Pearson, and often went through Cuneo's. In fact, they would go out to the this nightclub that I was talking about, the Stork Club, and other places in Manhattan. Hoover liked to go out at night, and he would go out with people like Walter Winchell, and realizing one hand washed the other. A lot of the fame that Hoover enjoyed was because of Winchell, and Winchell always promoting the latest gangster arrests that Hoover was making with the FBI. And so it was suggested by Hoover that they go through Ernest Cuneo as the most effective way to do that. And so Cuneo went to the White House, got the approval. This was really a remarkable thing because at that point, Roosevelt was saying publicly, "I won't send your boys, your sons to war." But he recognized that we had to be prepared for this. And so the White House did approve it, and they essentially said to Cuneo, "Tag, you're it. You're going to be the one who becomes the intermediary between the White House and the British." And that's indeed, and that's why I call Ernest Cuneo the first American spy of World War II. He was already at war before Pearl Harbor. He was already working with the Brits, and that's how Ernest Cuneo comes into the picture.
I think the easiest question I can ask you is, who was Ian Fleming? And why
Yes.
why was he responsible for 25 movies plus 2?
Yes. He wrote a book called about James Bond, the character James Bond, which was somewhat inspired by William Stevenson. Um, and in fact, Cuneo became very good friends with Ian Fleming, who, as I mentioned before, he Fleming wanted to uh, relay his exciting experience. Fleming was a writer, but in 1953, he writes the first of his James Bond novels, Casino Royale. And there's a couple of instances in that novel, the James Bond novel, that were inspired by the experiences that he had at Rockefeller Center and as being a spy for the British during World War II. And he always remained friends with Cuneo. He became friends with Cuneo in the 40s while they were working at Rockefeller Center together. But later on, they created they were part of a company that Cuneo ran in New York, and Fleming was the British representative for a company called the North American Newspaper Alliance, which was basically sending out syndicated columns and such. But they remained friends. It was a vehicle for Ian Fleming and Ernest Cuneo and another friend of theirs, a longtime childhood friend of Ian Fleming's, Ivor Bryce, to work together. They were working in the same company together. And at a certain point, I think it's in 54, 55, where Fleming says to Cuneo that he knows America through Manhattan and through Washington, D.C., but he didn't know the rest of America. And so he prevails on Ernest Cuneo to go on this long cross-country ride. They first go to Chicago, they go to Las Vegas, and a lot of those scenes are representative in the James Bond books. In fact, Diamonds Are Forever, another James Bond novel. There's a scene where James Bond gets into a cab, and he notices that the cabbie's name is Ernest Curio, kind of a variation on his friend's Ernest Cuneo's name. And it turns out that the cabbie is working as a CIA agent in Las Vegas. So what I'm getting at is that Ian Fleming was able to take a lot of his experiences and incorporate them into the James Bond books. And in fact, Thunderball, the James Bond novel that later became a movie, that novel is dedicated to Ernest Cuneo, who Fleming describes as his muse. And in fact, Cuneo gave him legal advice. Cuneo actually wrote the original treatment for Thunderball. And at one point, Fleming wanted Cuneo to play the bad guy in it, and Cuneo didn't want to have anything to do with it. But the whole desire to capture this experience of World War II as spies and somehow put it into print, that was something that Stevenson wanted to do. It's certainly something that Ian Fleming did brilliantly with the James Bond novels. And it's something that later on Cuneo wrote a memoir, which ultimately was never published, but it was given to me by his family, Cuneo's family. And that was one of the major resources in writing this book, The Invisible Spy.
How much of a difference did it make that you were given that unpublished memoir by Cuneo?
It made a lot of difference. There was a lot of details that and how they felt and how he felt. His descriptions of Ian Fleming, for instance, are in that memoir. He talks about some instances, specific spy episodes that inform my book. But it also gives you a sense of the man. This is the second book that I've done, Brian, where I've been able to get unpublished memoir. I wrote a book about Masters and Johnson, the sex researchers, and William Masters' family gave me his unpublished memoir. And it was nowhere as detailed as Ernest Cuneo's, but something like that is real gold when you're a biographer. You have to check it against the official record, because obviously it's one person's version of the facts, or one person's version of the motivations of people. But in the case of Cuneo, it's really interesting because it provided it illuminated a lot of the characters who were part of the decision-making process for Roosevelt, particularly in regards to spying and for instance, Adolf Burl, who was an assistant Secretary of State for Roosevelt. He essentially was the national security advisor. He had been also a teacher at Columbia. That Cuneo happened to know him from Columbia, but Burl he's an interesting character. There are a number of Tommy Corcoran, Tommy the Cork was his nickname. He was a major advisor for Roosevelt. He's in there. So that memoir helps make people come alive in ways that probably I wouldn't have been able to find any other way except with a memoir.
Why didn't Ernest Cuneo publish it himself?
Well, he got off the he waited too late in life. Uh, the memoir that I had was almost like in batches, so it was still not pulled together, and there were other files. Cuneo's papers are at the FDR Presidential Library as well. And so I saw parts of that memoir in some of the files that he had, but the actual memoir was given to me by his son, John Cuneo, who passed away 2 years ago, who I actually dedicate. He's one of the people that I dedicate The Invisible Spy to. John Cuneo is a great help to me with this. And it was John who provided that memoir. And so between that and the papers that I got of Cuneo's and other people from the FDR library, that was really the heart of this book.
Ian Fleming died at 56 years old in 1964. Do you have any knowledge about how many of the 25 movies and books that were written on James Bond that he wrote, and who wrote them after him?
Well, there's a number of different people. I know there's a fellow named Raymond Benson who has been written some of the James Bond books following. There's an Ian Fleming Foundation that oversees some of this. And in fact, recently the rights to the James Bond movies were sold to Amazon. So Amazon will be overseeing the James Bond movies that we watch in the future. But Fleming lived a pretty hard life. He drank quite a bit. He liked to party. So did Ernest. Uh, but in Fleming's case, he died as a fairly young man, and he died just as he was becoming very, very famous. It was John Kennedy, President Kennedy, who was a big fan of Ian Fleming's work. And when Kennedy was elected president, actually, Life magazine, I believe it was, wrote a piece about what are the most interesting books that the president is reading, and one of them was a James Bond novel. Also, Jackie Kennedy was a big fan of James Bond novels and actually told Alan Dulles at one point, she sent a copy of one of James Bond novels to Alan Dulles. In fact, Dulles authorized some of the people at the CIA when Dulles was the director of the CIA. This is in the early 60s. The feeling was when they would watch some of the James Bond movies and see some of the gadgets that were being used, and the conversation was, can the CIA actually come up with gadgets like this? And that's been reported in not only my books but a number of other books as well. So Fleming had, he died at a point where he was just becoming internationally famous, and his initial books were not selling really well, and that's one of the reasons why he went on that field trip with Ernest Cuneo, because he wanted to understand America in a greater way. And it was Cuneo who drove him all around and showed him the sights: Hollywood, Las Vegas, Chicago. And so, like I said, Fleming, he died too young, but he was a great friend of Cuneo's.
I did see a figure. I know whether you know this. Something like $7 billion is what's been generated by the Ian Fleming franchise.
I wouldn't doubt it. I mean, it's been one of the most remarkable movie franchises in history. It's one of those things where with Cuneo, his friendship with Fleming is really not known. And in fact, towards the back end of my book, I explore his impact on Fleming and on the James Bond projects and such. But like I said, it was remarkable about Cuneo. He realized in life that you could get more done by not taking credit for things than by always being out there in front. In fact, Cuneo wrote a biography Fiorello LaGuardia, who was his first mentor, and that book became a Pulitzer Prize winning musical on Broadway. And yet he never gave credit. The New York Times actually had an article and said that it was based upon a book by Ernest Cuneo, but he never asked for a piece of, of the receipts from that play. It was a funny thing about Ernest Cuneo, and he just realized that by remaining anonymous, that he was more effective, that he could affect more things, represent his clients more effectively, so it was intriguing to me in a world that we live in that's so celebrity oriented and where everybody's looking for fame, that here's a fellow who spent most of his life realizing that he could be, as Gore Vidal once described him, at the center of everything. But he did so by not drawing attention to himself.
Ernest Cuneo lived to be 82 and died in 1988, if my information is correct. But near the end of the book, you say, but Cuneo admitted to being annoyed when learning a few of Fleming's secrets revealed in a biography after his death. You want to tell us what those secrets were?
Yeah, I think it had to do with, off the top of my head, I remember saying that in the book, and it would had to do with Fleming, where he went to school and things of that nature. But it was always that Fleming held something back. There were, I guess, when you're friends with other spies, everybody learns to hold something back, to keep it their own counsel about certain things. And so he was surprised that he thought he knew everything about Fleming. And Cuneo was surprised when he read in some of the early biographies of Fleming details that he didn't know. That wasn't
Well,
the only biggest. I'm sorry.
I was going to say the specifics in your book were that Fleming had said he went to Eton, the famous school, high school over there in Great Britain for the up and comers, and also that he had not gone to the military academy at Sandhurst, but he'd given everybody the impression that he had.
Yeah, he
Who was
definitely. Mhm.
go ahead.
Oh, Fleming, what's interesting to me about the friendship between Cuneo and Fleming, Cuneo was a football player. I mean, at a certain point, after you start playing, he was like a traveling refrigerator. I mean, he was 5'9", but a big husky guy. He was a New Yorker. He spoke with that rat-tat-tat type of tabloidese of a guy who had grown up in the Manhattan uh, a tabloid era. Actually, at one point, Cuneo worked for the Daily News while he was going to law school. Fleming had that more sophisticated air about them. In fact, during the war in 1940, when the British were over here, but first coming over here, Cuneo would go over to Stevenson's apartment with Fleming, and they'd be sharing drinks. It was very sophisticated. The fact that these two very unlikely characters became such good friends was also something that was very appealing to me.
We're going to briefly interrupt this conversation and continue in a moment. You got to read this paragraph that you wrote on page 423. Initially, Cuneo would, quote, scorn the idea of Dicky Ellis being a mole, unquote, based
Yes.
on weak circumstantial evidence. But eventually he acknowledged that, quote, in this vale of tears, anything is possible. Indeed, there may be some merit to H.L. Mencken's dismal observation that while it is a sin to think evil of people, it is seldom a mistake, unquote.
Yes, there it is. It's all about Dicky Ellis. Who is Dicky Ellis? Dicky Ellis was an Australian who became part of the British intelligence apparatus. He was a short little fellow, very friendly. He became the number 2 working for Stevenson at Rockefeller Center. Dicky Ellis was the fellow who was always more than happy to help everybody. He helped they had a thing called Camp X, which was on the Canadian border, right in the Niagara Falls area, in that area. But it's where they trained both British and American saboteurs. And it was a big operation hidden away in the woods there. Dicky Ellis would keep an eye on that. He, as the number two for Stevenson, Stevenson was often Stevenson as the head of OSS was traveling a lot. So it was Ellis who was running things on a day-to-day basis, often at Rockefeller Center. Also, when the Americans are creating the OSS, they are relying on the advice of Dicky Ellis in large part. And so Dicky Ellis seems to be everywhere. Hoover didn't like, there was something about Dicky Ellis that J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, didn't like. Part of it seemed to be just a turf battle that Hoover wanted to do more foreign intelligence with the FBI, and the president didn't want to see that happen. But there was one point during the war, early on, where Hoover wanted to get Dicky Ellis out of there, and it was actually Ernest Cuneo who vouches for Dicky Ellis at the behest of Stevenson, who's relying on Dicky Ellis to run things for him while he's away. And so Ernest Cuneo vouches for Dicky Ellis with the White House. It becomes what was not known, though, was that Dicky Ellis was apparently a double agent at one point, a double agent for hire. He was a fellow who apparently was taking money from the Germans early in the war, but then was later apparently a Russian double agent, that he was working for the Russians, as were a number of other people. And that did not become known until the Venona papers became known in the 1980s. These were encrypted messages that the United States was able to get access to. And as we started to decode these messages, and initially the United States didn't make it known that we knew about these messages, but some of those messages indicated that Dicky Ellis was a double agent, that he was working with the Russians. And certainly, I discuss this in my book, The Invisible Spy. So by like the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, more and more suspicion arises about who might be a double agent for the Russians. This is this point we're in the heart of the Cold War. And so there's that famous Kim Philby and the Cambridge Five. These were British agents who turned out to be double agents working for the Russians. But arguably, you could say that Dicky Ellis was the most successful of them, if indeed he was a double agent. And it seems to me there's enough experts who have looked at this that indicate that Dicky Ellis was a double agent. And so when this started to come out in public, people like Bill Stevenson, who had been who had been the number one with Ellis as his number two, or and Ernest Cuneo, they looked at this and they said, how is this possible that no, Dicky Ellis could not be a double agent? But as time went on, Cuneo did have second thoughts about that. And that quote that Brian, that you mentioned from his memoir, that indicated to me that he did have some severe doubts that indeed Dicky Ellis had been a double agent for the Russians. In many ways, he's the most invisible spy of all.
When did they shut down the British operation in the Rockefeller Center?
Well, gradually they did it. Primarily, it came to an end once Pearl Harbor happens, and but a number of the people were still here. It didn't formally end until the end of the war. I know people like the British writer, children's book writer, Roald Dahl, who was also a British spy during the war. He helped put together a secret history of the British security coordination that was published in 1998. That was also a resource for me in doing this book. But it all came to an end at the end of the war. Stevenson went home. Dicky Ellis went back to London, and then we had the OSS. We dissembled we closed down the OSS, our own spy agency, after realizing that, whoa, we need spies during wartime. Truman came in and he closed down the OSS, and then about 2 years later, he realizes the error of that way, and that we really do need spying. The United States had been historically very much against the idea of espionage, generally speaking. In fact, there's a famous quote by Secretary of State Henry Stimson, who said that gentlemen do not read the mail of other gentlemen. And so we came to spying as a country in a very slow way. You know, we live in a time where we have all these different intelligence agencies, not only the CIA, but other intelligence agencies. But at the beginning of World War II, we really had nothing. And we were putting this together. And even once we had it, we closed it down, the OSS, and then later created the CIA. So we were really slow to learn something that somebody like Winston Churchill knew from the outset, that that espionage is an incredibly important tool in wartime, particularly. And so to me, Ernest Cuneo's life, his life and times, was a window on the origins of modern American espionage. And it kept from the beginning of World War II all the way through the Cold War and all the way up to the JFK assassination period.
How much do you credit, or did anybody back then credit, this operation, which you say was called British Security Coordination, or the initials BCS? How much of that had an impact on getting us into World War II?
Well, there were a number of different factors, as you know. Obviously, the attack at Pearl Harbor was the igniting point on it, and for months, if not really years, Roosevelt was being urged by Churchill to get into in the war, and even though Roosevelt knew that, he was very slow. It really was the attack at Pearl Harbor, but Roosevelt knew that war was going to be inevitable, and he did prepare for it. And so um, uh, he did appoint a fellow by the name of William Donovan. Wild Bill Donovan was his nickname. And he was initially, he was the person who wound up heading the Office of Strategic Services. And Ernest Cuneo worked for Donovan, his unofficial title as an intermediary with the British from roughly the summer of 1940 until the Pearl Harbor attack in December. That was an unofficial thing with Cuneo. Really, very few people knew about that. But then Cuneo, it becomes official, his position, when the OSS is created. He's working with Donovan, and Cuneo's job is described. He becomes the liaison. In other words, he's the middleman dealing with the Justice Department, with J. Edgar Hoover, with the FBI, with the Treasury Department, and with the White House itself. So he is a guy who I thought was really interesting, because he's in the center of everything, as Gore Vidal said. He's a guy who is involved with the media. He's a media influencer. He's a White House insider, and he's also the first spy of the United States in World War II. He's the one who's there at the very beginning of our whole what is now a huge intelligence apparatus in the United States.
Are you still associated with Newsday?
No, quote unquote retired after 40 years. I spent my last year as on the editorial board of Newsday. Most of the 39 out of 40 years was as an investigative reporter for Newsday. I'm now working on other projects. And so it's fun to do that on a full-time basis. I'm finally doing I've given up my day job and my nighttime job of being a book writer and being involved with films and being involved with TV shows has become my full-time job.
Masters of Sex was your creation?
It was. I came in one day to Newsday and they said, "Hey, this fellow Bill Masters is retiring. we'd love to try to do a feature. Do you think you could get an interview with him? And I called Masters, and I was on the phone with him for about a little under an hour. I said, wow, a man and a woman studying love and sex who are not married, then they become they get married, they become world famous experts on uh, during this America's sexual revolution, and then after 20 years they divorce and nobody knows why they got divorced. And I said, there's got to be a story there. And at the time I was writing a biography of the baby doctor and peace activist Dr. Benjamin Spock, so I didn't get around to it for quite a while. But when Masters of Sex, that was the name of the Masters and Johnson biography, when it came out, it was reviewed by the Times and very favorably, and Hollywood came and it became a Showtime series, an Emmy-winning Showtime series that was on about 10 years ago. It was on for 4 different seasons. A lot of great people, a lot of great actors who were involved in it, and so it was a lot of fun.
Why did Masters and Johnson get divorced?
Well, they at the beginning of the book, you are introduced to the very first love of Virginia Johnson, and then Bill Masters had a girlfriend. It was actually the sister of one of his college roommates, and they have a both of them did not wind up getting married to their youth, their lost loves of their youth, and I described the reasons why. But later on, after all of this life experience with Masters and Johnson being world famous, Bill Masters bumps into his lost love uh, of, of, of his youth. And he decides that his marriage with Virginia Johnson is more of a business arrangement, that he really doesn't love her. And so on Christmas Eve, he announces to Virginia Johnson that I'm going to get divorced from you, and I'm going to get married to his beloved Dodie was her name. And so he goes off. And at the end of Masters of Sex, my book, Virginia Johnson goes looking for her lost love of her youth. And what happens there, I described. And actually, the lost love, I apparently became part of the OSS. Believe it or not, I didn't know. I didn't realize I would be doing a book later on involving the OSS. But yeah, that's how they wound up getting divorced. It was a long story. That was some incredible love story between Masters and Johnson. It was quite a lot of fun.
You live where?
I live on Long Island. I live in the Huntington area. And so I've lived here I have 3 adult sons. I just became a grandparent. My wife and I live here in Long Island. And as I said, I've been at Newsday. Newsday had a history of producing a number of writers over the years, some very famous writers, and a number of people have written Pulitzer Prize winning books and such. And so I found it to be a good haven for me to be an investigative reporter by day, but be a book writer at night.
If I count right, this is your 9th book?
Yes, I'm just starting my 10th book. I'm on chapter 3, and it's all very hush hush right now, but yes, I did one novel that came out over the summer, and that was somewhat inspired by my experiences with Hollywood, with the whole Masters of Sex experience. And it's a murder mystery, but it's based upon a reporter who's working for a newspaper, not unlike the New York Times, and he's covering the Trump campaign. It's the summer of 2016. And this reporter has written a book like Masters of Sex that looks like it's going nowhere until Hollywood discovers it. And now they're filming a TV show out in the Hamptons about that book. So the novel's called Montauk to Manhattan. And literally that's what the protagonist, his name is Jack Denton. He goes back and forth, and there's a murder that happens. And at the end, it all comes to a big surprise ending.
We've been talking about, among other people, Ernest Cuneo, and the name of the book is The Invisible Spy. And our guest has been Thomas Maier. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Brian, it's a real honor to be with you. I've admired your work for many years. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Mr. Maier.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.